Hello, friends, and welcome. Welcome to Leadership for the next 10 years, all in 1 hour. That's a great time right there that you get. That's an hour well spent. Good afternoon to you all in the West and East Coasts. My name is Father Lorenzo Labrija. I am the director of TryTank, the experimental laboratory for church growth and innovation. And I want to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. We will be beginning in just a few minutes. We want to let a couple more people come on in. We have more than 500 of you who will be joining us this afternoon. Thank you for being here. As we begin, I'm going to put out a question to you all that will be as a poll, because we do want to make sure that all of you know how to use the poll. So the first question that sort of gets us thinking about the future is, in the next 10 years, do you see the world getting better or getting worse? So there is the poll, and I'm going to leave it up there. So do you see the world getting better or getting worse in the next 10 years? Wow, you are all voting quickly on this. Man, I will not have to do a recount either. It looks like it is coming in clear as day. So while we do that, everybody, welcome. We're glad you're here. Again, there's a poll as you first join us. In the next 10 years, do you see the world getting better or getting worse? This gives us our orientation. I just did a wonderful course with the Institute for the Future. We'll be talking to Dr. Johansen from the Institute for the Future in just a moment. I did a course where I'm now a certified foresight practitioner. And we really need to have more people of faith take these types of courses where you can find out, not with certainty, what the future is going to be. This isn't about becoming a fortune teller, but it's about finding those signals that let us see a preferred future and how we may align ourselves to do that. And this is one of those questions that they ask us to begin with, because it gives us an opportunity to see where the people that we're talking to, sort of their orientation towards the future. I see that about 89% of you who are on right now have voted so far. So thank you. Welcome aboard. Welcome, everybody. So make sure that you answer the question on the poll. We'll leave it on for another 30 seconds, and then we'll finish the poll, and I'll give you the results. Again, there will need to be no recount on this poll. If you do have questions throughout the webinar today, please use the Q&A button. I see some of you are saying hello in the chat box. Hello from the various places that you all are, including the UK and the Virgin Islands. Jealous, hashtag jealous on that one. So there is a poll, so just make sure that you are answering the poll as you get to it. We have about 500 of you who are registered for 506 was the last number that I saw. So nope, 514 was the final number that I saw. So hello to everybody. Welcome. So there we are. The poll is now officially over. You can see the results that the majority of you think that the future is better, of the ones who have voted in this early part of the poll. Of course, those of you who registered for the webinar who will get it afterwards may not be seeing the poll right now. I hope you do actually in the recording. But the results were, in the next 10 years, I see the world getting better. 70% of you said that. I see the world getting worse. 30% of you said that. So that gives us an orientation. And with that, I'm going to say hello to, I am so honored to be the one greeting our speaker today. And from the first time that I read his book, before I met him, and I just sent him a random email saying, hey, Dr. Johansen, I am curious about the future. He has always been so kind and so generous with his time and just pointing me, our work, towards the right direction. And so when I found out, and so we did a webinar with Dr. Johansen before, which was about the future of faith. And we talked a little bit about that. And that was based on one of his books. And he has 3 books out, by the way. And you can find those books. Not only is he kind enough to come and join us to speak this afternoon, his books are also at a 40% discount. And you'll get this in the follow-up email, but you can go to trytank.org/leadership, trytank.org/leadership, and you can find the books there, and you'll be able to see that all of them are 40% off, which is a great. So Dr. Johansen is someone whose job is to look into the future, whose job is to try to tell companies, the world, governments, others, hey, This is where sort of things are pointing towards. What that has meant, though, it means that he has come up with ways that leaders can best embrace that future, can be prepared that no matter what the future is, because you're never 100% certain, no matter what the future is, and this for all of us, since this is a Christian institution, for all of us who are pre-eschaton, so not the end of times quite yet, but that future in between now and when Jesus comes back, that eschaton, between that time, how can we best be prepared for that? So before I turn it over to Dr. Johansen, just quick reminders. Use the Q&A section if you have questions. We will be breaking up during times to answer some of those questions. I will be looking at those questions, so just make sure that you're using that part. I want to make sure that all of you, remind you that you'll be getting an email with the recording of this, and also with all the links and the slides that Dr. Johansen will be showing this afternoon. I also want to thank Josh Brown from the Lifelong Learning Department at Virginia Theological Seminary, who is running the back end of this webinar. So thank you, Josh, for that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will disappear and I will introduce you to Dr. Bob Johansen.
Thanks, Lorenzo, and great to be with you all. And this will be an interactive session. I'm going to focus on leadership in the future and my trilogy of books that I just finished, and share with you some of the latest insights. And I also want to begin with the events that are surrounding us right now. And I'm very impressed that you come out optimistic about the future, given all that's going on. I share that optimism, but I'm a future back guy. So I see it more optimistic from the future back than I do from the present forward. Because right now the present is so noisy and so frightening, and in many days so depressing. So I'd like to share with you just what futures thinking can offer you. And I'll say a little bit about my personal background. I did go to divinity school. I went to the same divinity school Martin Luther King went to, Crozier. I was there at the time Dr. King was killed. It shaped my life. I have an MDiv degree, but I've never chosen to be ordained. I've more focused on the future and the human and the values side of it. I did a PhD in sociology, and when I went to Northwestern, I thought I was going to become a professor of sociology of religion. But then the internet happened. It was called the ARPANET in those days, and I got to be one of the first social scientists on board, and began to look at, wow, this phenomenon of what we now call social media, what we now call collaborative systems. We were involved in that in the early days, and I was a professor for a while and just didn't have the patience to be a great teacher. But I love the research that I do. So I'm an applied futurist. I kind of do work with clients and do custom forecasts. We actually did a custom forecast for the Episcopal Church, for the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, SEEP. And that was in 2008. Turned out to be a very accurate forecast. If you've never seen it, we can post a link to it. But at any rate, I'm very interested in your faith. I'm particularly interested in your faith, the concept of discerning questions, which I've found really powerful. So let me jump into a short presentation, and then I'm going to go in rounds here, talking with Lorenzo, and then talking and inviting your chat comments. So I'd rather do more conversation, less presentation, but I'm going to start with some presentation focused on this idea of full spectrum thinking. And I want to begin with a forecast from the book that I finished called The New Leadership Literacies, which was the second book in the trilogy. And one of the key forecasts, which I'm absolutely sure will happen, is that if you think 10 years ahead, again, thinking future back, anything that can be distributed will be distributed. So as you listen to the hearings today, for example, and I have to say, I'm not an expert in the present. I don't talk about politics, but I do teach at the Army War College, and they read these books that you're reading, and I teach the new generals, get them, the new 3-star generals. I get them on their first week in Washington. And I'm very empathetic with the military is much better than we are at being clear or being what they call commander's intent, but being very aware of the dangers of certainty. And particularly in this kind of world where anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And I mean distributed, not just decentralized. And the internet is and will be an amplifier. So it doesn't predetermine anything, but it amplifies everything, everything. And it's also harder to build trust through the internet, social media in particular. It's easier to seed mistrust and distrust. And we're certainly seeing a lot of that these days. And I love the way Michelle Dean said it, the author Michelle Dean. She said, authority has become something diffuse and flammable, like spray paint, spray paint. And, think of that. Think of that in the context of today, where people are very concerned about authoritarianism and very concerned about kind of a rise in authoritarianism, popularism around the world. I'm really not. In one of the recent sessions I did for the Army War College, I was teaching the new 3-star generals, and right before me was Madeleine Albright, very intimidating slot. She was talking about her book, Fascism, A Warning. And I read the book. I really love it. I have great respect for her, but I'm much more optimistic than she is, because I don't think fascism scales in this kind of world, because anything that can be distributed will be distributed. So certainly people will be attracted to easy answers in the short run, but again, it won't scale. So I'd like us to think today about where we're going to be 10 years from now on the spectrum of humans to computers in this world where everything that can be distributed will be distributed. And you see on this spectrum, on all the way on the left side, that's the purely human, the human assisting humans. And purely to the right is machines assisting machines. So think of that as a distribution. 10 years from now, 10 years from now, we're all going to be deeply digital. Every leader is going to be a cyborg. Every leader is going to be enhanced by computing. The question we're going to answer, and I hope the faith is involved in answering this question, the question we're going to answer is, what are the things that computers can do best? What are the things that humans can do best? And as we move forward, right now, we have these functions in business or even in the church, human resources or HR, that's the human side. And IT or information technology, that's the tech side. But in the future, we're going to have to be a blend. We're going to have to be cyborgs. We're going to have to be hybrids of technology enhanced people. I love the term Tom Malone uses in his new book called Superminds. Tom is a professor at Sloan School at MIT. And what he says is, the big story of the future is not computers replacing humans, although that'll happen in some limited ways. The big story is computers and humans working together to do things that have never been done before. Never been done before. And that includes churches. Who are the superminds of the Episcopal faith? And we all have to be them. It's not just the leader on the top, it's the leader from behind, the leader at the foundation, the servant leader. So what are the role models? Mr. Spock. I just been watching a wonderful documentary about Mr. Spock done by Leonard Nimoy's son. And Mr. Spock was a model of a supermind. He lacked emotions because he was this hybrid of a Vulcan and a human. And he was a scientist by training. So it was kind of the ultimate rationality, but his emotions were always sneaking out at him. So he had emotions. It was just with Mr. Spock, it actually tended towards the IT side, the machine side, but there was a real human, a real emotional side too. But we need other models. Mr. Spock's been around a long time, very provocative, but that's an old model. We need new models. And you, the people on the call, the people involved in TryTank, you are the models for how this might work. You are the superminds. So here's another key forecast, and then I'm going to open it to conversation for the first time. And again, this is something I'm sure about. The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty, because it's just too brittle, And brittle breaks. What we need to do is be very clear where we're going, but very flexible how we get there. Many are certain, but few are clear. So as you watch these hearings today, I listened to them on the way over here. As you watch these hearings today, listen for the people who are clear and listen for the people who are certain. Most of the people I hear who are testifying at that hearing today are certain, but they're not clear. That is really dangerous. And it's of both parties. They're certain, but they're not clear. We need to be voices of clarity. Now, my new book, which is what we're going to talk about today, Full Spectrum Thinking, the final book in the trilogy. Full spectrum thinking is much more optimistic. Instead of categorizing, instead of certainty, we look with clarity across a spectrum of possibilities. And the future will reward full spectrum thinking. And it's going to punish the kind of categorical thinking of, Republicans, Democrats, blacks, white, men, women, gays, straights. Those kind of binary categorizations get us in a lot of trouble in this particular future. But it's really good news that the tools for full spectrum thinking are getting so much better. And in a future where anything that can be distributed will be distributed, that leans toward democracy. It leans toward participation. It does not lean toward command and control. So the VUCA world, I teach at the War College. I mentioned I'm not a military guy. I just happened to be there the week before 9/11. They call this future the VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I've flipped that term, and I think you'll be interested in this term. I flipped it because the next 10 years are going to get increasingly VUCA. So I must admit, on your poll right at the start, Lorenzo, when I'm sitting here this morning thinking about the next year from the present looking forward, I think it's going to get worse. I think it's going to get worse. It's only when I think future back that I get optimistic. And what I believe, and I now teach this, this is Bob's positive VUCA: volatility will yield to vision, uncertainty will yield to understanding. And this is a time to be listening to each other, not to be shouting, not to be shouting. Clarity, complexity will yield to clarity. And again, be very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there. And ambiguity will yield to agility. We all have to be athletes. We all have to be physically, mentally, and even spiritually, although not necessarily religiously, spiritually grounded. We have to be athletes. We have to be agile. So this is the trilogy, and we'll send you links to these, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I want to give you a taste. The first book, Leaders Make the Future, which I did right after 9/11, identified the 10 leadership skills that will be needed to thrive. And I think they're the right skills, and I'll give you a taste of them later. But skills aren't enough. You also need literacies, which are practices or disciplines. And finally, you need a mindset. And that's the mindset we're here to talk about today: full spectrum thinking, which is the ability to make sense out of the future, to get your clarity across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptations of certainty, the temptations of mindless categorization, the temptations of thoughtless labeling. Categories coerce. And I should say, I'm not completely against categories if they're accurate and if they're fair. All of science is actually based on categorization, but the best scientists are always questioning the categories because categories coerce. And binary categories are the worst. And we're in deep, risky, dangerous territories here because digital media that we're growing up with and that are so shaping our thought, digital media are inherently binary. It's classifying everything by zeros or one. That's what binary computing is. But quantum computing, which is beyond 10 years out, that's anything but. That's full spectrum computing. And blockchain, which is distributed authority computing, the internet, which is driven by packet switching, those are distributed media. So we're moving past the binary, but the binary still shapes us. The binary still constrains us. And our brains are a part of the problem here. Our brains want certainty. There's a lot of neuroscience in this book because I had to study the science of this, the brain science. And our brains want certainty, but the future needs clarity. So we have to essentially teach our brains new tricks. So here's the spectrum, how you might apply it, and then we'll open the conversation. Think of the spectrum, the full spectrum of value and values. And one end of the spectrum is self-interested, one is mutuality. In this VUCA world of the next decade, we clearly have to lean toward mutuality, and we have to develop a currency of mutuality, and we have to moderate self-interest. Very difficult to do, but that's one of the great dilemmas of faith. Organizations, distributed movements are the future. Hierarchy is the past. Hierarchies will work in conservative, slow-moving, linear times. They don't work in the VUCA world. We need shape-shifting organizations. And we can come back and talk about those, where hierarchies are still there, but they come and they go in a much more fluid way. With regard to social meaning, we have, with social well-being, it needs to be a mainstream concept, not just a marginal concept. And there's always been people who are Christ-like, who are considerate of social well-being, who are doing the right thing for everyone, but they've always been in a minority, and they have to be much more mainstream. We have to figure out a way to address this rich-poor gap in a humane way. Diversity, this spectrum from to be different to belong, and kind of getting beyond binary choices. In a full spectrum world, systemic racism would be much more difficult to scale, because we'll see that full spectrum of possibilities and move beyond those mindless categorizations, the mindless binary choices. With regard to purpose, the spectrum of hope to fear, I'm really optimistic about kids, for example, if they have hope. And we're all in this very serious, very dangerous game of hope over the next decade. So final thing, and then I want to open it up. Yesterday's tools of categorizing were really organized around binary computing, but we've got this new set of digital tools: big data analytics, visualization, machine learning, blockchain, gameful engagement. These new tools are becoming practical. So for you all, even though many of you won't come from technical backgrounds, I didn't either, but the tools are becoming much more practical now. And that's what makes me so optimistic. So just as the VUCA world is getting so much worse, the tools of full spectrum thinking are getting so much better. So let me pause right there and stop sharing and come back, Lorenzo. Let's have a conversation with you and me first. Then I've got lots more content I'm happy to share, but I'd rather follow the conversation. And I've already introduced plenty of things which need some conversation, need some discerning questions to make sense out of them and then to apply.
And
Please.
several people have asked some questions in the Q&A section, and I encourage all of you to have more questions. Please go ahead and put them in there. But several questions that came in were related to, can you speak a little bit more about the difference between certainty versus clarity? And I'd like to use an example, if I may, to see if I'm sort of catching it right. And I think you talked about it there, is being able to look at something and say, there are 5 different ways that we could do it, not just one. Whereas when you seek the certainty, it's like, it's this way or the highway, right? That old statement. It's like, we must go only this way, as opposed to, but there's 5 different ways. Why did we take that road or that road? Which makes you a little bit more adaptive to other options.
Yeah, exactly. So certainty is to say something will happen or something, must happen in a very narrow way. So it's expressing that with certainty. Clarity is about direction. So you're being very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. And what you want in a VUCA world is clarity, but you want to resist certainty, because certainty is brittle. Certainty breaks easily. So we don't, for example, at the Institute for the Future, we're the longest running futures think tank in the world. And we don't use the word prediction. We just don't use it. If somebody uses it, we correct them. What we say is, if somebody tells you they can predict the future, you shouldn't believe them, especially if they're from California.
Hey.
So the point isn't to predict. Nobody can do that. The point is to look future back and develop stories of the future, and then test those, as you were saying, lay out a range of alternatives, come up with your best forecast of where you things are going. And that's your clarity of direction. And then come up with how might you get there in different ways. So for example, this leads industries. Mostly we work in business. So mostly I work for very large companies doing custom forecasting. In the auto industry, it used to be that companies thought of themselves as car companies, and their clarity was, we build cars. Now, every automaker I know, we just did a 30-year forecast for Mercedes, for example, but every car company I know talks of themselves as a mobility services company. A mobility services company. That's their clarity. Now, if they have to make cars to do that, that's one way, but there's lots of other ways. So the clarity is around services. So you have to ask yourself in the context of the church, what's your clarity? And then around that, how do you pursue that? So that's where these kind of forced choices that things, churches get so polarized around. When we did the forecast, the custom forecast for the consortium, that was 12 years ago now, a little more than 12 years ago, you were just stuck in this debate around certainty around ordination of gay bishops, and it was framed in a very binary way. And there's just no way out of that. you got to say, what's your clarity of direction, and then what's your flexibility. And so anyway, to try to link it to your world without, I'm a humble futurist. I'm happy to share what I see from the future back, but I'm not here to tell you what to do.
Now, somebody asked, what does social well-being mean? And would you use an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So the question here is, how can we address the rich-poor gap and develop clarity around what are the social assets as well as the financial assets, and how might those be shared or at least be accessible in more fair and more equitable ways. In the new book, my biggest external threat challenge is the rich-poor gap. It's hard to do a forecast where the rich-poor gap gets better. It's easy to do a forecast where the rich-poor gap gets worse. And what we have to do is figure out what are the various forms of assets, including social assets, like access to air, clean air, access to clean water, access to parks, and how do those assets get shared more equally and more fairly? And we've got an Equitable Futures Lab at the Institute, which I invite. Can you also put the Institute's website on, Lorenzo, in the chat? And you can see there, my colleagues are much deeper on this than I, but even before the COVID crisis, they did a study of Americans, US citizens, and what they found was about half of US citizens had zero assets. So it's not just having a job, it's having assets. And how do you grow those assets? How do you share those assets? How do you develop equity around those assets? And it's a really big challenge. We've also got a related project on the future of work and post-COVID scenarios, because COVID's making this worse. And there's fundamental challenges, because if you look 10 years ahead, we're going to have fewer traditional jobs. That's just inevitable. But what will these more flexible, more gig worker type jobs, what will be the social assets, the social context, the benefits? How does that work when there's fewer traditional jobs? And in California, there's a fascinating initiative that actually passed, and a House Assembly bill, which has also passed, which causes gig workers to be classified as employees. Now that won't scale. I mean, it's just not going to scale over the time, but they're right in trying to address the fairness issue. And how does that play out? So that's going to get sorted out over the next decade. And it's got to address that spectrum of social benefits, not just wages and not just kind of economic wealth, but social assets in the broader sense.
Excellent. And I think maybe that's a good, we have a ton more questions, but I also know we have a ton more content that's really good. I've seen the slides are coming up. So why don't we go ahead and continue on, and then we can come back at the next break. I know there's another one coming up. So I'm going to disappear, and Bob, if you can continue again, and we'll come back to more questions. And
Great.
remember, people, just keep putting your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the next little break.
That'd be great. That'd be great. So this break's going to be shorter. Um, and I wanted to just remind you of the two previous books, the skills and the literacies. And here, Lorenzo, I'm just going to introduce them very quickly and then open the conversation if you want more detail. So there's 10 new leadership skills that I think are vital for the future. And in the center, you'll see the two most important. The first I call dilemma flipping. If you look at the VUCA world 10 years from now, there's going to be many more problems you can't solve. That's what I call a dilemma, but where you can improve them, where you can make them better. And the challenge is, how do you accept that it's a dilemma, not a problem that can be solved? And then how do you flip that into an opportunity? And the neat thing is, if you look long, if you look 10 years out and work future back, you can identify those opportunities for dilemma flipping, for essentially turning a lemon into a lemonade. And the big lesson of this is you have to avoid judging too soon. That's the classic mistake of the problem solver, the classic mistake of the polarized kind of true believer person who's stuck in categorical thinking. So you don't want to judge too soon. But on the other hand, you don't want to decide too late. That's the classic mistake of the academic. So you've got to like that space between judging too soon and deciding too late. Again, if you listen to the hearings today, ask yourself, how many of those folks are actually thinking of this challenge as a dilemma that's not solvable, but you can improve? And my answer is not many. You want to find clarity. You want to find clarity, be very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there. The military has a whole language around this, and I talk about them in all my books: commander's intent, mission command, and flexive command. And it's all about clarity of direction, but flexibility of execution. That's what you need. That's what you need to thrive in this world. So look upper left, immersive learning ability. That's essentially gaming. 10 years from now, these kind of cyborg leaders, they'll all be gamers. We'll all be gamers, because what we think of as video gaming today is the world's most powerful learning medium 10 years from now. We all have to learn immersively. We all have to game our way. And the kids got a competitive advantage because they're growing up with video gaming. And it's true, some of those games are too sexual and too violent. And as parents, we need to moderate that. We need to help kids make smart and moral choices. But they've got mental abilities we don't have because of that immersive learning ability. Now, in Silicon Valley, we call that rapid prototyping. Fail early, fail often, fail cheaply is the motto in the Valley. And we got to get that mentality. That's the way we innovate. And TryTank is all about that, the way I understand it. You've got a lot of this going on. You're searching for commons. What do we have in common? What do we share? Constructive depolarizing. You've got to be able to acknowledge the polarity and then make it better. And again, I heard a few of the speeches today, and as I was driving, where people were trying, Congress people were trying to be constructively depolarizing. We need more people like that. To the right side all the way, bioempathy. We've got to be sensitive to nature, sensitive to our bodies, sensitive to the importance of building natural models into our decision-making. Quiet transparency is, I think, what's going to win in the future, not the kind of arrogant leader, but the leader with humility and with strength. Smart mob organizing, I think in a real sense, that's what you all are. You're smart mob organizers. You want to organize a mob of innovators within the Episcopal faiths. And we have to figure out ways of doing that, not like the mob we saw last week, but like the mob kind of organized for good. And they need to tap into that maker's instinct that we all have, that ability to and interest and need to make things and grow things, because you want to make the future. The title of this book is Leaders Make the Future. So you don't want to predict it in a passive way. You want to make it. So here are the literacies, and then I'm going to open it up again and we can dive into any of these. I'm going to share these slides with you, by the way, so you can have them and work with them. I'd love to see you use them in your churches and in your programs. But the core literacy is looking back from the future, but acting now. And I'll go into that a little later in a little more detail, but it's basically thinking future back instead of present forward. And the reason you look 10 years ahead is because it's easier. It's easier than it is looking just 1 or 2 years ahead. So for example, 10 years ahead, it's obvious we're going to have sensors everywhere. They're going to be very cheap. Many of them will be connected, and some of them will be in our bodies. So my guess is with an innovative group like yours, we've got 500 people online. Half of you wear body sensors already, like Fitbit or Apple Watch or some kind of body sensor. 10 years from now, the same group, all of us will be wearing body sensors that want them, and half of us will have embedded body sensors. So think of that data. It's easy to imagine a scenario there where Apple and Microsoft and Facebook and other sensor companies know more about your own personal data than your doctor does. It's hard to do a scenario where you imagine your doctor knowing more than the tech companies. Now that's kind of scary, but it's really, really interesting. And just ask yourself, in a world where sensors are everywhere, where's the church? Where's the church? Well, the church is everywhere. The church is everywhere. And sensors are your eyes and your ears and your ways of feeling what's going on. But you got to know how to use that sensor data. That's what I mean by you'll all need to be cyborgs to do that. You'll all have to be augmented, not AI, not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. In the upper left, voluntary fear, that's my next iteration on gaming. We want to take the things that frighten us and immerse ourselves in that and practice in low risk ways. I got to visit, as part of my Army War College work, visit the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert it's the US Army Training Center. And I got to think about it as I was there as the world's largest video gaming parlor. It's about the size of the state of Rhode Island. And they play games there 2 weeks, 24 hours a day. Everybody wears sensors, linked by satellite. They have real tanks, real helicopters, real Afghan actors. 2 weeks, 24 hours a day. And most people lose to the home team, designed to be harder than real warfare. Many people are killed without having to die. It's so powerful as a learning medium. That's what we need. That's what we need in churches. That's Sunday school of the future, is a gameful fear engagement with the future, which helps kids and helps adults better manage that future, better lead, better make the future. In the upper right, the shape-shifting organization. That's the church of the future. It's not a hierarchical command and control church. And, you are the Episcopal faith globally, the Anglican faith, you're structured like a shape-shifting organization. You're a network church, and you've got those disciplines that are historically passed down over the years. Shape-shifting. It's just, you've also become kind of awkwardly hierarchical at times. And you have to sort out when hierarchy works and when it doesn't, and how you become a more powerful shape-shifting organization. Lower right, being there without being there. We're learning so much more about this now in the shelter in place with media like this. As a leader, you have to be better when you're not there than when you are. That's a real challenge, but there's ways of doing it, and we're learning those ways. And then finally, you have to create and sustain positive energy. That's your job as a church leader. How do you go into a group and bring energy with you and help to grow and sustain that energy? So let me pause again, Lorenzo, and come back to you. That's a lot to lay on you, but I know you wanted me to talk about leadership in the future. And what I'm doing is sharing resources with you. And there's the skills book, there's the literacies book, and there's the mindset book. And that allows people to go deeper after this session. But let's talk about just what your immediate reactions are and kind of how you see that applying.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because in the church, and several of the questions that have come up are related to this. In the church, I think people come expecting a certain amount of what they would see as certainty, right? That we can tell them about Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit and all that. But I think what that also leads to are some people that don't have they have a certainty, not a clarity mindset. And some of the questions that have come up is like, how do you approach if you are open to being more about the clarity than it is about the certainty? How do you deal with that certainty mindset of other people? You probably haven't counted this in the work you're doing. You go in to talk to executives and they have a certainty mindset. So how do you get them to come around the other way to see that there are other
Sure.
possibilities?
Sure. So here's where future back thinking really helps. What you want to do is go far enough out in the future to get beyond the polarities of the present. The polarities of the present. And 10 years out is usually about how far we go out and work backwards, but sometimes we have to go further. So I did a project a few years back on the future of food security for a very large crop protection and seed company in Europe, in Basel. And it was really a challenge because we were doing a 10-year forecast. And in Western Europe at that time, there was a lot of very smart, very sincere people who believed that GMO foods was a yes, no choice. You're either for GMO foods or you're against. So it was a certainty. It was yes or no. GMO foods are not a yes or no choice. It's really about food chemistry. And GMO foods there's a spectrum of GMO, and some of them are good, some of them are bad. It's not a thing, and it's not an either or. It's a spectrum. But we couldn't even have the conversation at 10 years. So we ended up doing a 30-year forecast instead of a 10-year forecast.
Because that's
And
how far you had to go into the future where there
we
was
had to go
no.
that far into the future, yeah. And by going 30 years out and talking about food security and global hunger and those kind of topics, it's obvious. It's obvious you have to talk about food chemistry. And oh yeah, you have to come back to talk about GMO foods, but it's really different than the conversation about GMO foods right now, which is in so many cases a really simplistic yes/no argument. It's not a yes/no argument. It's a spectrum argument. So what I find is if you go far enough out and work backwards, you can come up with a more solid conversation. Now, I remember some of the priests in the Episcopal faith, when we were doing our custom forecast, were telling me about the negotiations you'd helped to facilitate between Israeli and Arab conflicts. And oftentimes it was looking for the common ground and the shared values and then working backwards instead of starting from what you don't believe in or where you don't have the agreement. Start from where you do and work backwards. It's very similar to future back thinking. And I've got a whole chapter in the new book. It's actually my favorite chapter on the difference. It's broader spectrums of meaning. It's what it's called. And I talk very delicately. This was such a hard chapter to write, very delicately about the difference between faith and belief. Faith and belief. So faith includes questions, and faith is all about clarity. So faith is very much what I'm talking about in terms of clarity. Belief, especially extreme belief or rigid belief, that's closer to certainty. So sure, there are some things that we should be certain about, and it makes reasonable to be certain about laws and morals. And I'm not saying there's no certainty. I'm just saying limit your certainty, moderate your certainty, and develop your clarity.
Well, some of the questions that have come up are about the future back thinking. Specifically, it's like, how do you go 10 years into the future? Do you just say, okay, we are done with X and pretend there isn't a polarization, or ignore that in order to be able to plan? Can you give some concrete steps of how you would encourage people who have, and again, people, if you can take the class from the Institute for the Futures, it is awesome. It's really good. They do teach you about that. But Bob, could you go over some of if someone's sitting in a parish somewhere in North Carolina, how might they think 10 years out to then be able to do the future back?
Sure. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to shift and share screen again here. And I think this is where I want to go next. So think of full spectrum thinking as foresight, insight, action cycle. And I'll show you how to do future back. And this is very practical. You can use it tomorrow. If you go through our Foresight Essentials training, you'll get to do it much better, but this is enough to get you rolling. Foresight Inside Action. And foresight is a future back story with signals to bring them to life. And Lorenzo, you're already starting a signals database for TryTank, so you might talk about that later. But signals are the future that's already here, but unevenly distributed. And the amazing thing about being a futurist for as long as I have, almost nothing happens that's truly new. Almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So it really isn't a question of what's new, because if it's truly new, it's almost certainly not going to happen. It's a question of what's ready to take off. What's ready to take off. So that's the forecast. So our foresight, we do a kind of a main forecast, kind of our best guess, essentially. And I should say we're usually right. We've been doing this 50 years, and we actually keep track. Out of 50 years, 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have actually happened, depending on your definition of happened. But it turns out that's not the way you evaluate a futurist. That's the way you evaluate a fortune teller. A way you evaluate a futurist is, does the foresight provoke your insight? And an insight is an aha, a new story, a new pattern of connections in your brain. And once you've had an insight, you can't go back. You can't go back. It's so much more important than an idea. And you don't have to agree with the foresight to have an insight. Some of the forecasts we make, I hope they don't actually happen, but they're designed to provoke insight, and ultimately to lead to action. And an action is an agile way forward, expressed with clarity, and again, ideally as a story. So notice story appears at each place, and you all get this. I mean, the Episcopal faith is so good at storytelling. You've got great storytellers. So you want to have a compelling story that embodies the foresight, that allows people to create new stories through insight, and then a story of action going forward. And here's where the future back comes in. Where most people are now is they think about the now, and then they think about the next 2 or 3 years. So they may have a 2 or 3 year plan, and then they think about the future, but they rarely get there. So it's kind of now, next, and maybe. But present forward, especially in such a noisy time as this, and so much critical crises that you all have, you just never get there. So in business, I think this was a strategy model developed by McKinsey. They talk about Horizon 1, Horizon 2, which is usually 2 to 3 or 3 to 5 years max, and then Horizon 3, which is usually 10, or in some cases more, 10, or could be even 20 in certain cases. That works fine in predictable, linear, more kind of calm times, let's just say. Doesn't work at all in the VUCA world, gets you in a lot of trouble. But in a VUCA world, if you can somehow think now, future, and then back to next, or future back, and it's still the Horizon model, but you do Horizon 1, then Horizon 3, then Horizon 2. And the amazing thing here is that it actually is easier to do 10 than it is 1 or 2. But you do have to decide how far out do you want to go. And as I said in my earlier example, sometimes it's more than 10, depending on the particular topic you're focused on. So let's come back. What I would suggest for the folk, just as a practical takeaway, think foresight inside action. Just, it's an ongoing cycle, not just a one-off. Think future back. And when you're developing your strategy or your plans, look out 10 years and just use that. 10 years is the sweet spot to us. So we usually start with 10 and then decide, do we have to go out further? I'm always reluctant to go closer in because there's so much noise, particularly in a crisis period. But for example, we just did a custom forecast for a big video gaming company on the future of interactive entertainment. And they said, oh, we can't go 10 years out. We're going to go 3 to 5. Well, I said, okay, we'll do that, but we're going to go 10 on our own anyway and work our way back. And if you want to see that, we're happy to share it, but we're going to go 10 and work back because that's the best way to do a high quality 3 to 5 year view.
You know, Bob, when you talked earlier, and this, a lot of people are talking about the certainty versus clarity part, right? Which, and you were talking about you want clarity of direction and certainty. And did I get that right? Was it certainty in execution or?
No, certainty tends to be outcome oriented or values oriented or yes no oriented. So clarity though is about direction, usually not about outcome. What I said, mobility
Yeah.
services as a corporate example. Um,
And,
what you're really aiming for is your direction, not your outcome. And it's not, and what you say is there, in futurism we have this term cone of uncertainty. The future is always a cone of uncertainty, and the purpose of futures research is to reduce the size of the cone of uncertainty. It's never a point unless you're a prophet. And I mean prophet in the biblical sense. If you're a prophet, you don't need to talk to me because you know the future. You know the future, and sometimes prophets are right. It's just most prophets are wrong. So false prophecy is really dangerous. I got to work some with Steve Jobs, for example. Steve Jobs was clearly a prophet. But I got to work with the emerging technology group at Apple at the time Steve Jobs was there. I knew Steve Jobs was a prophet, and I really admired him. He's amazing. He really does, the line that he and Alan Kay used was it's easier to make the future than it is to predict it. And he knew what the future is. And if you look at his work when he came back to Apple, he looked 10 years ahead and he said, this isn't a computer, this is a digital appliance. And the digital appliance includes music, and it includes phones, and it includes a whole array of things, a kind of platform hub. And then he worked backwards from that. So he really did reduce the kind of uncertainty, but most of us aren't prophets.
yeah, that's
And
true.
we humble futurists, we have to help reduce the cone of uncertainty, and we listen to the prophets and the self-proclaimed prophets. But I'm also very cautious about them because they're almost always wrong. And then every once in a while, you got Steve Jobs.
And it's interesting that you talk when you talk about the difference between certainty and clarity, and certainly as one of the skills to have. One of the things we've seen is when we went into lockdown, and most of the Episcopal churches are still not meeting in person. Some of them are, but most of them are not, or they might be meeting in parking lots. But where we are seeing churches that are sort of thriving, even in the midst of a pandemic, were those who are more clear about that the mission is to create disciples in the world. It's not necessarily to gather on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and to do it
Yeah.
exactly this way, right? So that when that sort of was, that's all we know how to do, we're seeing those churches that have had more of a struggle to get to be able to
Yes.
do digital church and all the other churches, whereas those who were a bit more clear about this, we're really just about making disciples. And if we need to use other tools now because of the reality of a pandemic, then that's just the way it is. And we're seeing that those churches are still thriving, even growing during this time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see that. And I imagine the definition of growing may vary as well. Let me share another image, and this hasn't been published yet. And it's a little out of order. I'm going to go up here and just, this is thinking about time and place in the post-COVID world. And so post-COVID, what's the spectrum of media that will be best for which tasks with which people? And I want you to think about this. I mean, I'm trying to share something with you that you can use. So let's think about this in terms of where does faith happen? Where does it happen? And church services were what I call in business, it's in-person meetings and offices. And traditionally, it's best for orientation, onboarding, trust building, and early stage creativity and renewal. So think of that as churches. And I'll give you this, and I'd love to see somebody just turn this into a worksheet and say, okay, what do we need to do in person for worship services? And then think, for our clarity, what can we do virtually, through Zoom or Teams? And it's best when some presence is useful, but meeting a difficult person is difficult or impossible. But I think there are cases where meeting virtually is better than being there. And I challenge you to ask yourself, what could we do better if we weren't there in person? And I'm sure there's some answers. And then there's mobile, best when portable, flexible, speed is preferred. Then there's asynchronous, which are things like Slack or Google Docs or even email chains. They're best for task tracking or implementation or coordination. Asynchronous, again, how can faith work in asynchronous ways? And finally, same place, different time. When a physical location is required. And I'm in the business world, so it could be a factory or a retail store or a distribution center. But in your case, it's a church. How could a church be used in different times by different groups? And then finally, the forecast, the younger you are, the more you want mobile. So in 2030, the interfaces for mobile will be much more graceful than today's kind of smartphones. So think of that time place. This was originally a matrix when I first published it, but I've turned it into something much more organic. But your question is essentially, where should we do which tasks and when should we do which tasks? And again, thinking future back, I think you can come up with some very creative ideas for how worship might occur, how social action might occur, how community building might occur.
Another question that's come up, and by the way, I love that slide. I'm totally stealing it. We're going to use it at TryTank to do good stuff with it. Trust me, you just helped the church. When you spoke about dilemma flipping, could you give some examples of that? I know you spoke about the current example in Washington, but what might be a church example of dilemma flipping?
I'm not as close to the church anymore, so I'm not sure I'm going to come up with a very
Or
good
maybe even in a small business. What would be a small business sort of example or a business example of dilemma flipping?
Yeah.
You spoke about GMO.
So a dilemma might first of all, it's a question of a dilemma is a problem you can't solve and it won't go away, but you've got to figure out a way to improve it anyway. And the first rule of thumb about dilemmas is if you're not sure if it's a dilemma or a problem, you should always assume it's a dilemma, because if it turns out you can solve the problem, you get extra credit. But if it turns out you say it's a problem and you can't solve it, then you're in a deep hole because people think you just failed. So the first challenge is how do you turn it into an opportunity? So an example, we were setting up a test of a video conferencing system. This was with Procter and Gamble, and the dilemma was, how could we set up a prototype for a limited period of time that would give people a chance to experiment with different forms of video communication? But we went to all the vendors and the options. We wanted these to be room-based in different regions around the world. And all the options we got were too expensive. So Procter and Gamble is the world's largest advertiser. And they reimagined what it is we were proposing as a pilot test. And they went to their advertising agencies and said, we want to do a commercial about how to connect different locations virtually to have team meetings in an effective way. So we want you to do an advertising commercial set for a series of 30-second spots. So instead of building rooms and creating permanent infrastructure, they were setting up a commercial set. And the ad agency built the set. And then they say, oh, we decided not to do the commercials, but we'll pay you anyway. And they ended up using the commercial set to run the trial. So that would be an example of kind of reimagining the problem. So they didn't really solve the problem. They just kind of managed the dilemma. But there's an interesting lesson coming out of it. It was all about reframing the problem. And if you're stuck in a way of categorizing what your needs are, sometimes you just need a way to reimagine, to reframe the problem.
Excellent. So it's reframing the problem. That is, and again, it goes back to, in this volatile world, what we need to do. And unfortunately, that's going to have to be the last word, though. It is. We are up against the hour, and we do try to keep it all on time. So, ladies and gentlemen, by the way, Bob, he lost power and had to drive through closed streets because there was a storm in northern in off the island where he lives near Seattle, or in Washington. So Bob, thank you for all the effort to be with us today. I really appreciated that you did all this. It is.
I hope it worked. This is not my normal. Normally, I'm inviting people into my study, and we live on Bainbridge Island, Washington. And last night was very stormy, and we've got a generator, and I got the electricity going, and I thought I could do it that way, but then I lost my internet connection. So fortunately, I was able to visit our daughter's house, and I'm in her study doing this.
Before you all go, there is one last poll. If you can just go ahead and answer the question, we'll leave it up there while I say my goodbyes here. I want to make sure to remind you, you will be getting a follow-up email. And in the follow-up email, you will have access to the video recording of this, so you can share it with others. And you will get the slides that Bob mentioned. Again, links to the books so that you can get all the books and be able to learn more about this. TryTank does a lot of this work that Bob was talking about, and make sure you sign up for our newsletter so that you always know what's happening. And the signals that Bob was talking about, we're always on the lookout for those. No, 10 is the best, 1 is the worst. So 10 is the best, 1 is the worst on a scale of 1 to 10. So make sure that you're signed up for the TryTank newsletter so that you can find out about the signals that we're seeing around the world. Thank you again to Joshua Brown from Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary, who ran the back end of this webinar today. I will also in the email put sort of some of my notes and highlights that I took of this. So thank you all for being here today. God bless you all. And we will be in touch next time. Until then, thank you.